Welcome to the C.M. Russell Museum campus in Great Falls, Montana, and to our virtual speaker series focusing on missing and murdered Indigenous women. The speaker series has been pre-recorded for quality assurance. Due to COVID-19, our institution has been affected, and like many others, we had to close our doors to the public and to in-person programming in the spring of 2020. Since then, and at the time of this recording, the museum has reopened to the public and we are continuing educational programs on a virtual and modified basis. One of these programs is the Studio Conversation Series, a program series with the objective to engage program attendees with Charlie Russell's studio in a way that Charlie himself may have done. Through intimate social gathering, humor, storytelling, and sharing of knowledge and perspective, and lively conversation. In addition to completing each painting in his studio from the year it was built in 1903 until the year of his passing in 1926, Charlie Russell was known to entertain friends and neighbors within the space. The C.M. Russell Museum is fortunate to have been awarded a CARES Act relief grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to fund the completion of a publication of a digital catalog for the recently restored and reinterpreted Russell Home and Studio, belonging to Charlie Russell and his wife and business manager, Nancy Russell. In addition, the Studio Conversation series has been funded and will be included with the final digital publication as an educational extension of the curatorial interpretation. The new interpretation of the Russell Home and Studio seeks to incorporate a stronger presence of Native American voices and contemporary topics. Because of this, the C.M. Russell Museum has partnered to create the American Indian and Educators Focus Group, which holds advising power in helping to create a more inclusive development of exhibitions and educational programming within the museum campus. It is through this advisory group that the museum, as an institution, has begun the work of delving more deeply into these important topics and making connections with those who can educate us and our community. One such contemporary topic is the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Over the course of our speaker series, we will take a look at firsthand family accounts, data mapping of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and advocacy and support. The conversation you will hear next is with Annita Lucchesi. Annita is the founding executive director of the Sovereign Bodies Institute and a Ph.D. student at the University of Arizona. She is a researcher, a scholar, and a community organizer of Cheyenne and Italian descent, currently living in Wiyot territory in Northern California. Annita's community-engaged work and scholarly projects are both inspired by her experience as a survivor of violence and stem from a commitment to uplift other Indigenous survivors and those impacted by violence. Annita is the founding executive director of Sovereign Bodies Institute, a nonprofit research institute dedicated to community-engaged research on gender and sexual violence against Indigenous people. Sovereign Bodies Institute builds on Indigenous traditions of data gathering and knowledge transfer to create, disseminate, and put into action research on gender and sexual violence against Indigenous people. For more information on Sovereign Bodies Institute, please visit their website at sovereign-bodies.org. Secondly, Annita is also a doctoral student at the University of Arizona in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. She is pursuing a minor in gender and women's studies. Annita is an Indigenous Data Sovereignty doctoral scholar at the University of Arizona's Native Nations Institute and serves as a board member for the University of Arizona Consortium on Gender-Based Violence. She earned her BA in Geography with a minor in Global Poverty and Practice from the University of California, Berkeley, and graduated from Washington State University with an MA in American Studies. Finally, Annita has nearly 10 years of experience as a freelance cartographer and has created maps for academic publications, community organizations, and public awareness. She has also worked to support Indigenous mapping initiatives, led art-based mapping workshops in various communities, and worked on several projects utilizing maps to combat extractive industries. Her specialties include mapping Indigenous narratives, mapping for social justice, and mapping geographies of violence. Her research interests include Indigenous and critical cartography, Indigenous feminisms, post-colonial geographies, Indigenous data sovereignty, femicide and gender-based violence, and Indigenous research methodologies. Her dissertation work examines the intersection of data, violence against Indigenous women and girls, and cartography by studying how data on colonial sexual violence and mapping technologies are utilized in tandem to subjugate women and girls and occupy Indigenous homelands. Please welcome Annita Lucchesi. Well, first off, Annita, I just wanted to say thank you for agreeing to be a part of our speaker program focusing on missing and murdered Indigenous women. I think it's a great gift that you're willing to share your knowledge and expertise with us. And so I thought we could just start by jumping into a few questions about your work. The first question I have is, one of your areas of expertise and research as a scholar is that of Indigenous data sovereignty. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Indigenous data sovereignty and why is it so important?
Sure. And I'll just start by saying thanks for having me and inviting me to take part in this awesome program. And it's such an honor to have my voice alongside Cheryl Horn and Jennifer White Bear. They're two amazing women and MMIW family members. To speak to Indigenous data sovereignty, I want to start by saying that I learned pretty much everything I know about Indigenous data sovereignty from our board member, Desi Rodriguez Lowenbear, who's a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, as well as Stephanie Russo-Carroll, who runs the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collaboratory at University of Arizona, where I'm a PhD student. What I define Indigenous data sovereignty is basically the right that Indigenous peoples have to have sovereignty over data that's about us or about our homelands or our peoples or our cultures. So that can apply to all different kinds of fields, whether it's stuff like what we're talking about today with gender violence, or it could also be environmental information, demographic information, you name it. And really the idea behind it is that in order for our nations to fully implement their sovereignty, they need to have access to information about their citizens and their communities. And they can't do that if they don't have access to an authority over the data about their citizens. And even for folks who live in urban communities or live in communities that maybe aren't federally recognized, this principle of data sovereignty is still really important because fundamentally it's about self-determination as a people. We make our best decisions about how to care for our communities when those decisions are informed by data about us. So it's about building our ability to take care of our people to the best of our powers. And it's also about making data something that works for us rather than harms us. For hundreds of years, there's been really exploitative research on Indigenous peoples that has been harmful, rooted in stereotypes or racism. And even to this day, research is used to mobilize stereotypes around Indigenous people as alcoholics or as criminals, when we know that's not really who we are. And if we had authority over what kind of data was collected about us and how that data is used, we might be able to do more for our people, and also help folks to understand that, you know, we're human beings like everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can understand and see how if somebody else is making data on your people, especially if it's data that is being put together from a bigoted, for lack of a better term, perspective, it's like, yeah, they could very much focus on the negatives, where really you could take any group of people and focus on the negatives of that group of people, be it alcoholism or whatever else, and choose to collect and distribute data. And so for anyone to have knowledge of what kind of data is being collected on their group of people, you know, on their race, on their ethnicity, is to have power, I think. And that's why I think what you're doing is really, really wonderful, because it's turning around not only those stereotypes, but also turning around the authority of, no, you're not going to collect, you're not going to keep reporting on how many alcoholics are Native American, or how many, you know, we're going to start looking at who's done really powerful things, or some, you know, more positive aspects, just to turn that mindset around.
Yeah, well, and that's really where our organization, Sovereign Bodies Institute, comes in with our database on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, but also just our kind of core value as a research organization. So much of the data that's gathered on violence against Native women in particular is gathered by the federal government and doesn't really fully reflect the realities of our experiences. So I'm sure everyone's heard the 1 in 3 Native women will be raped statistic. It's very common. Most people have no idea where it comes from, when it was published, who did that work, who they talked to. I have an auntie who says, well, I want to go talk to the other 2, because she knows that the numbers are usually much higher than that. So statistics like that just don't really help us, because they're not accurate, number one. But I think they're also, they instill a lot of fear in our communities. They don't mobilize us to end sexual violence, or don't help us work to support survivors in their healing. It's just not helpful. So that's kind of where SBI came in and said, well, what if we did it differently? What if we did research on these forms of violence in a way that was healing, empowering, or mobilizing? And what would that look like? And, you know, SBI in our work every day, we're trying to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Just so if anyone who is watching this isn't familiar with them, can you talk a little bit about the data that you do collect and how you use it?
Sure. So we have on our website, which is sovereign-bodies.org, we've got a lot of information about the database for folks who are curious and learning more of the details. But just to give a sense about the database, we track whatever the community tells us to track. So it grows every day, not just in number of cases, but also in the kind of information that we gather and that we care for. So when we go to different tribal communities and present the data to folks in that community, oftentimes people will say, well, it'd be really great if you included that, or it would be super helpful if you thought about this. And every time somebody says that, we add those categories to the database. So it's grown quite a bit over the years. And in general, we collect information not just on the victim and what happened to them, but also how the law enforcement and justice system responded, or in most cases didn't respond. We collect a little bit of information on the perpetrator, for example, their relationship to the victim, or what race or gender they are. But we also try to collect information that helps us do justice to the victim and honor her as more than just a victim. So that would include her name and her Indigenous language, if the family's comfortable with sharing it. If she was a mom, if there are other MMIW cases in her family. We try to get a broader understanding of the impact of that loss on the family and on the community, so that we're really doing justice to what happened. So that's a little bit of a sense of the database. One of the things that I'm most proud about the database for is it's cared for and maintained by Indigenous survivors and family members of missing and murdered people. So I myself am a survivor of domestic violence, rape, and trafficking. We have other staff who have experienced other forms of violence in our MMIW or MMIP family members. And so it's really meaningful for us. We're personally invested in caring for this data. And as it shifts and grows and is used in different ways, it's a part of us and our individual stories too, and our stories are in that data. So I think that's one of the things that sets the database apart from maybe other efforts around this issue, is that it is survivor and family led.
Yeah, I would say that it sounds like it's then in the safest hands that it could possibly be in, especially as it is your lived experience included in that database. And then also you're the ambassador for that. So it's, I mean, there's no safer way, and I think more accurate way than to have somebody caring for it in that manner.
And we're fortunate to have a really amazing board of all Indigenous women who each in their own ways bring their own knowledge and skills to the decisions we make, not just about the database, but about all of our work. But the board helped us create our data sharing protocols. So I think that's another thing that makes us unique, especially from law enforcement and government agencies, is that we do make the data available to the people who need it. We don't have it publicly accessible because we want to protect it from exploitation and protect the families whose loved ones' stories are in it from harm. But we do make it available to tribal governments, to Indigenous anti-violence organizations, even other Indigenous researchers. It's not something that, you know, we gather and just kind of hoard. It's something that we gather and really care for on a daily basis.
Well, you use it in a productive way. And I've both heard you say before in webinars that I've watched with you and Desi Rodriguez Lombert, as well as on your website, that you indicate the sacredness of the data. And yes, you certainly want to protect the families who have entrusted you with the information, because it is so sensitive and heavy to carry, and to trust somebody else with it is a big it's a big thing. But conversely, you do want to be of help to others who might need it too. So I just really appreciate your vetting process with that, and I think it's a really admirable and integrous vetting process.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. So going off of continuing to talk about data, you mentioned how there's other places that hold this data. So talking about what are these other entities that have data, and what are they, and how can people access them?
That's a great question. We actually published in May this year, and it's free for download on our website, an MMIWP organizing toolkit. And the idea is that there's an entry point for everyone to participate in the movement, whether it's policy or boots on the ground work or healing work, or, you know, whatever your passion is. And there's a chapter on data in that toolkit that kind of breaks down what some of the possible sources could be, and there's even a quiz to help you figure out what kind of data you should be working with for your project. So I would highly recommend folks interested in data to check that out. But in terms of where we get our data, we use a method that's kind of, I lovingly call it data collection by any means necessary. So we do start with official government records, whether that's missing persons databases, or we also file Freedom of Information Act requests with law enforcement offices. But that process can be really draining. Sometimes it can take over a year to get a response back. Sometimes it can take over 20 follow-ups to get a response. Sometimes, like, we've gotten bills for like $5,000 just for police departments to look and see what they have. And of course, we don't have money like that. So, and we shouldn't have to pay $5,000 to find out what MMIW cases are in their jurisdiction. So we start with that, but that process is really limited. And even in a best case scenario where we do get data, for example, the Montana Department of Justice has been pretty good about releasing data when you file a request. Even when you get that data, it's always incomplete. There's always cases that aren't documented for whatever reason. Maybe they weren't officially filed as a missing persons report, or they weren't classified as a homicide and were misclassified as something else, or they weren't documented as Native. That happens quite a bit too. So we start with that data, but certainly can't end with it. We add to it by mixing it with data that we pull from social media posts, news articles, historic archives. We try to be as creative as possible. And in Montana, the conversation around kind of unsolved murder cases has been going on for decades. The tribal newspaper from Fort Peck, which has all been digitized and is available publicly online, they've had stories on this issue since the 70s. So there's quite a bit of information out there if you're willing to kind of put in the elbow grease and the creativity to think about where it might be. Tribal newspapers are a great resource, and even archives that may not necessarily come to first mind about a place where you might get data. For example, Canada doesn't have the death penalty anymore, but when they did, they kept a log of everyone who was sentenced to execution. We pulled that log. We looked at all of the cases where someone was executed for killing a woman. We found those women's names, and then we worked backwards to try to identify which were Indigenous. And it was a challenging process, and mostly was through the help of our relatives in Canada who were able to look at surnames and locations and follow up on specific cases. But we were able to add over 40 cases to the database that way. So it's definitely, it's a lot of work and like dry work to sit and read 100 years worth of newspapers, but it's worth it.
And I really love that approach. What did you say? You lovingly referred to it, collecting data by any means necessary. And I really love that because you're someone who's very accomplished in data collection, and you are currently pursuing a Ph.D. And you're a rock star in this field, and you're really leading the way. You're one of the people who's really pushing this forward in terms of collecting data on missing and murdered Indigenous women and making sure there's no misunderstanding about what those true numbers are. Or you're doing work to make sure it's as clear as possible. But one thing I've also loved is that, again, in the webinar I watched with you and Desi, there was reference made to data warriors, how anybody can do this. Anyone can be somebody who investigates or uses the numbers to help. And so how could somebody use data research as empowerment if they're someone just wanting to get started and start looking into it?
Sure. I love the idea of data warriors. That's actually something Desi came up with. And she wrote a book chapter on how we can all be data warriors. It's in a book called Indigenous Data Sovereignty, which is also free for download online. And it's an amazing book. So if there's any nerds out there watching, definitely download it and read it. And Desi does a much better job explaining how to be a data warrior than I ever could. But in terms of being a data warrior for MMIW, I think, data collection at the community level is important, but I think also being able to facilitate conversations in your community around what MMIW data really means, because when we take that apart, it means we're also defining who's Indigenous and who's not, what's considered a murder and what's not, who's considered a woman and who's not. And those are things that can be hard for our communities to talk about, but it drastically changes what data you're willing to include or not and how you go about collecting it. For example, we had a great conversation in our staff meeting this morning about the challenges in collecting data against Two-Spirit and Native LGBT folks. And especially, I think for trans folks, it's near impossible. Really, the only way to gather that information is to talk directly to their communities or their families, because law enforcement just doesn't bother to collect that information. And oftentimes we've seen with murdered trans women is that they're in law enforcement records, they're still being documented by their dead names and by the wrong gender. And so if you file a request for murdered Native women, they're not going to be identified as a woman, even though that's how they identified and how they lived their life. So, you know, we, in our staff meeting, we were talking about, well, how do we move away from that? How do we acknowledge that these existing data systems just don't match the lived reality of our Two-Spirit relatives? And so we're trying to get around that by starting to do some virtual talking circles specifically for Two-Spirit and Native LGBT folks to share their experiences, to make sure that that information is gathered, because otherwise, if we solely rely on newspaper articles or law enforcement archives, the data won't exist.
And that's what I think is really great, because that is making change for the better, in that when you talk about transgender people or Two-Spirit people, they're still going to be documented by what the world thinks they should. It's like, these are our standards of documentation. It's like, well, no, if they live their life as a woman and are a woman, then you can't take that out of the crime that is happening toward them as a woman, right? So I think that's really important to include that in the discussion. So your research comes into play visually on the maps that you create, and you have 10 years of experience as a freelance cartographer. Can you share how you came into map making and how your research, advocacy, and map making intersect?
Yeah, I stumbled into map making on accident. There was never, and really that's how the database started too. There was never a day where I woke up and decided I'm going to be a map maker. And there was no day where I woke up like, I'm going to start a database. I think the best projects happen by accident, or happen because you're called to it, not because it's something that you wake up and decide to do. But I majored in geography as an undergrad. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what geography is as a field. I think when we hear the word geography, all of us think like, oh, you know, memorizing where places are on the map. And I did have to do that as an undergrad. It is a completely useless skill that I can name every country in the world now. But really, that's not what geography is. Geography is the study of space and place, and the study of our relationships to each other as they pertain to spatial organization. And I know that sounds kind of techy, but I think geography is one of those fields that's kind of inherently Indigenous, because it's all about our relationships to each other through the land. And that's something that no matter what culture you're from, if you're Indigenous, that's something that's kind of a root value of all of our peoples. And I got into map making because, well, I had to take intro to map making as an undergrad, and I fell in love with it because I was learning to do it at the same time that I was reading all of this really awesome post-colonial theory, like Edward Said or Frantz Fanon, all of these scholars who were working in places like Northern Africa and the Middle East, but we're doing this amazing work making sense of colonialism and decolonization. So to read that at the same time that I was learning to draw maps was like all these light bulbs were going off, like, wait a minute, there's so much power in getting to draw maps. And maps don't have to be bad. Like, we can take some of that power and use it for good for our communities and towards this kind of decolonization. And that's what got me really excited about them. And I know a lot of people think of map making as something that is like really scientific or takes special software or all sorts of special training. And really anybody can make a map. That's the beauty of it. You can be illiterate and still be able to read a map. All of us have, as kids, have made treasure maps at one point. Like, we're all cartographers for that reason alone. So I think for that reason, maps are really democratic, and they're a really awesome way of kind of integrating art and cultural ideas with stories about the land and with data. So to me, it makes total sense to have Indigenous cartographers, because it's exactly how we think and how we tell stories.
My words. Indigenous women go missing and are murdered at more than 10 times the national average. Is that accurate data? That's what I pulled. Okay. And these crimes are overwhelmingly committed by individuals outside of the Native American community. Crimes are likely in remote settings where extractive industries, such as oil workers, employ transient workers in rural areas near tribal lands, and crimes are committed and often fall between jurisdictional cracks, leave victim families without recourse. But crimes are also urban and do not just take place on and near tribal lands. And I think that's important to note, because one thing that I know for sure in being non-Native is that there's kind of this surprise that Indigenous women also are taken, go missing, and are murdered in urban areas as well. It's not like it just happens on tribal lands, and it's like, well, because they're being targeted. And so what are effective ways, my question for you is, knowing all this, what are effective ways to spread education and awareness and bring to light the fact that Indigenous women are being intentionally targeted? And how can we stop it? For lack of a better, I mean, maybe that's like a big order on the agenda. How can we stop it? But it's not.
Yeah, you could rephrase that question and say, like, how does Annita get to retire and become a florist? That's my dream for, like, when all the violence stops and all this is over.
When it's all stops, you can become a florist.
Yeah, I mean, florists are part of people's happy moments, baby showers, weddings, like, proms, that's my thing. So I think there's kind of it's a two-part answer to that question. The first is, how do we raise awareness about this issue happening even off of tribal lands or reservations? Then the second is, how do we violence or end Native women being targeted for violence? And so the first part about raising awareness, I think it's Montana is amazing in that it's really become the hub of the MMIW movement nationally. The tribal communities in Montana, both urban and reservation, have been so dedicated to this issue for so many years now, that we've seen some really amazing marches and different awareness events and vigils. So I would definitely encourage folks to show up and support those kind of ongoing events. If folks are able to show up to those events, that really means a lot. But also just, you know, there's statewide and national dialogues on this issue. Make sure to share those news articles. And there's a lot of stereotypes around Native women and around this issue. And it's really important that when this topic comes up, if you hear someone vocalizing those stereotypes, you know, maybe stereotypes that all the perpetrators are Native men, or that all the women were, you know, using drugs or on the streets, that's just not true. It's just false. And so correcting people when you hear that kind of thing goes a long way. And then I think the best work that I've ever seen an ally do was and she's from Montana, and she's a white woman, but this issue really weighed on her heart, and she started calling every newspaper and press outlet in the state every time a new case happened and said, "Why aren't you reporting? Why aren't you including this?" And she did it so many times that she kind of drove them crazy a little bit. And they were like, "Okay, lady, we get it. You need to leave us alone." And, you know, she's a mom with young kids, and she was like, "Look, I'm a stay-at-home mom. I can watch Frozen 5 times, or I can keep calling you."
Yeah.
And she kept calling, and you know, shortly after that, the Billings Gazette published their apology for not covering the issue as they should. And there's been more consistent coverage. So even something as simple as being stubborn and making phone calls goes a really long ways. Mm-hmm. Then the second part of that question, how do we stop Native women from being targeted? You know, I think combating those stereotypes goes a long way, but also this colonial system that we live in has always been based on violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folks. And that's not going to change. This justice system and law enforcement system was not designed to protect Native people from violence, especially women and Two-Spirit people. And that's not going to change. We can make it kinder and gentler, and we can make it work a little better, but it's not going to give us the freedom from violence that we need and that we deserve. So really, I think supporting efforts to build tribal sovereignty is the most important thing all of us can be doing. Tribes should have jurisdiction over crimes against their citizens, especially on their own land, but really wherever they are. And that's not the case anywhere. So in Montana, it's the FBI or the BIA that would have jurisdiction over a murder case on a reservation. And they've clearly failed on the job and are continuing to fail. So it's time to give that jurisdiction back to where it belongs, which is to tribes.
That makes sense. Because it shouldn't matter like who commits it or where they're from. It should matter who it was committed against and about protecting that person. And you're right, our systems for very like many years, hundreds of years have not been set up in favor to be of service to Indigenous people at all.
Yeah. Well, and you know, citizenship, regardless of what race you are, citizenship isn't a geographic convenience. So, you know, all of us who are American citizens, if I were to travel to France on vacation and get murdered in France, it's not American jurisdiction, it's French jurisdiction, but the US would still be notified and brought to the table because I'm an American citizen. That doesn't happen for tribal nations, and it would cost no money to do it.
Mm-hmm. So how would it, I'm probably asking big philosophical questions. So then how would we do that? How would we push for, how would we push for tribal governments being brought to the table when that happens?
Well, SBI is trying to do that in Montana and California. That's where our two big regional projects are based. And it's an ongoing uphill battle. Unfortunately, law enforcement has a lot of systemic bias. And I think kind of a good old boys culture that's hard to break through. And I've seen a lot of law enforcement give a lot of lip service to this issue, and you know, when they're asked about it, show a lot of concern and express a lot of passion. And then when it comes down to translating that passion into institutional practices, that's where they really drop the ball. So I feel like I can't say that I have an answer on how to get law enforcement to do it, because we're still struggling too.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, especially given that we're we're in the midst of so much like amazing civic engagement and national discussions around representation in elected positions. It's important to remember that sheriffs are elected, coroners are elected, and those are positions we can run for. In Montana, all you need to be a coroner is to have a high school diploma. Anybody, like any of us, could run for coroner. And that position, unfortunately, is in many counties very corrupt. So it's not a matter of just asking politely, hey, could you call the tribe next time this happens? Because odds are they're not going to do it. It's also thinking about replacing those offices and holding people accountable at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. And those are very, very good actionable items that we're all capable of. Like right now, today, we're in the midst of the election. We're filming this on November 4th, and we're still in the midst of all the ballots being counted. But that's a great sign, because we have power as people to elect who are the people who are making our decisions for us. And we have to look at who's making the smartest decisions for our people. And then we have the power to run for those offices that we're eligible for. And in addition, I really love when your first comment was just being an advocate in correcting people, because silence when you know better is just as bad as being ignorant. I mean, silence when you know better and you can correct someone and say, no, actually that woman was not being trashy and on drugs. She was taken and she was driving home from her family's house. And, it's like, those are the stereotypes that we can correct. You can't just go right to saying something negative about somebody and writing it.
And to also really affirm the humanity of everyone. Like, it doesn't matter if she was on drugs or not. She didn't deserve to get murdered. Nobody deserves to get murdered.
Yeah.
Like, when I think about the long-term goal of changing our societal views around Native women or around violence like this, like, our youth are learning from us. Kids learn from us. And especially our boys, they deserve to see adults say, hey, it doesn't matter what she was doing. Nobody deserves to get hurt like that.
Yeah.
And right now, unfortunately, they're not always getting that.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about Indigenous women who have gone missing or been murdered, there are so many names. You can just keep listing them. And one of the ways to keep their stories alive is to keep talking about them if you can. And I mean, we've talked a lot about today what are some things we can do, but is saying their names enough? And I feel like it's not. I feel like we need to be doing more. And my question is, what more can we do to make change?
I think one of the most important ways to do justice to MMIW is to help take care of their families. Their families get, they experience such a horrific loss and then really get abused by the justice system and by law enforcement. And oftentimes by our own communities, whether it's in the form of, really vicious rumors or just kind of being expected to pick up and move on when, a family never really moves on from a loss like that. And there really isn't any kind of closure. And justice means a lot more than just a conviction. So I think really being supportive of families and taking care of them, even, on holidays, for example, SBI, we do a winter gift drive for families of MMIW, or we offer emergency financial assistance to families, because we know a lot of cases are elders raising their grandchildren because their daughter was murdered. And those elders are on a fixed income and need help, and that doesn't go away. That doesn't go away 6 months after a death or 2 years after a death. That can be 18 years and longer. So really making sure that you're there to support families in the long term is a big deal. But I think also one of the ways that I, because this work has its emotional challenges, and one of the ways that I navigate it is there's a Native historian named Jack Norton, and he's one of my favorite scholars. My dad's too. My dad was lucky and got to take college classes with him. But his specialty was studying Indigenous and especially California Native stories of genocide. But one of the things he's written about is, why do we study things like that? Why do we work on things like that? And what he says is that fundamentally, every human culture around the world has a way of making meaning out of death. And it varies from culture to culture, but we all have our way of making meaning out of that kind of loss. And when genocide happens, that right to make meaning is taken away. And that right to make meaning, when it's taken away, it creates a kind of spiritual or psychological wound in the community and on the land. And it creates a sickness. And that sickness doesn't go away until we start addressing it and talking about it and finding a way to make meaning. So when I think about the importance of the MMIW movement, that's what's at stake here, is a sickness in our communities that will not go away until we address it. We have a responsibility to make meaning out of death that's been made meaningless. Whether that means making sure that other women and girls and Two-Spirit people aren't killed in the same way and without justice for them, or making our communities safer. There's a bigger definition of justice at stake. And that's really the root of what we have to do in this movement.
I 100% have recognized, and even doing the speaker series, the weight, that the emotional weight that anyone who works with this topic carries. And it is not a lightweight. It is a heavyweight. And I just, I think that's really good advice, the advice to take care of the families, because their work doesn't end. That person that they lost is gone and was taken. And you're right, they're to have to then fight with law enforcement and fight against prejudices and stereotypes to move forward from that, and to have to deal with that pain is a lot. And the mental health that I'm sure, the effect on mental health that I'm sure family members and friends and community who are close have to deal with is great. So if there's been one thing that I have learned through all of this, and working with people like you and with Cheryl and Jennifer, it's like, you're brave for doing this work, because it is not easy work, and it is emotionally heavy work. And the families that have experienced it are carrying that. So my perspective is, if I wholeheartedly agree with you. If there's any way someone can come along and pick a little bit up somehow, I mean, maybe it doesn't help. Maybe it's, but maybe it's not the right way to put it. But if someone can come along and help anyway carry that weight, or and maybe they can't take it away, but make it easier to carry. I don't know if that's the right way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, be a listening ear, help babysit grandkids, help, financially, especially if it's an elder raising grandkids. Be there for vigils and memorials. That goes a long way, because I think there's so many families where, they're allowed to feel the grief for maybe the first year or two, and then at a certain point, their extended family or the community expects them to kind of move on because they just don't have the energy to grieve anymore. And that's understandable, but it's not something you move on from, even if a conviction has taken place for the perpetrator. Nothing can replace, especially for parents who've lost a daughter or a son. There's nothing that can ever replace that, and that wound never goes away. So I think even just being a listening ear, so that families don't feel like they're being a burden or inconveniencing people by sharing their grief or their loss, that goes a long ways.
So, is there anything else? First off, this has been a really great conversation, and I really appreciate the time that you've put in to this and given to us. I do believe I feel it's a gift, and thank you for your honest answers, and just sharing your knowledge and information with us. Before we end, I wanted to ask you if there's anything that you would like to say or talk about that I haven't asked you or that we haven't covered.
Maybe one thing I forgot to mention earlier as a potential action item for people who want to get out and do more is Savannah's Act recently passed into law, and it's a federal law, so it extends everywhere. And we worked really hard to make sure that the version of Savannah's Act that passed included urban communities and PL 280 states. So it extends everywhere. And one of the really cool things about Savannah's Act is it mandates creation of protocols and practices for data collection and sharing on MMIP, but also on investigations of cases. And one of the things we pushed really, really hard for was for tribes to have the right to make their own guidelines and protocols. And that version did pass. So for anyone listening, especially those who are citizens of tribes, I would really encourage you to reach out to your tribal councils and your tribal leadership and remind them they have a right to create their own protocols for investigation of MMIP cases under the law. And the U.S. Attorney's Office has to comply with those guidelines, or has to create their own guidelines that match the tribes. So we have an accountability measure in place now that didn't exist before and is new. It's just a couple weeks old. So definitely encourage more tribal nations to exercise their sovereignty to the fullness of their ability. And that includes creating those new protocols and guidelines.
That's great. So we'll include a link to the Savannah's Act in the information with this video so that viewers can read more about it.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Annita. Again, it's been a great pleasure working with you and talking with you and learning from you, and just knowing that there's somebody like you that's out there doing this type of work. It's a relief, and I think it's really great, and it's been an honor. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me and for putting together this really amazing program. I'm really excited to tune in and hear Cheryl and Jennifer's perspectives too.